So the plain loaf and the brand that I associate with plain loaf is Mother's Pride. According to my research, Mother's Pride made its first appearance in 1936 and became a national brand in Scotland in 1957. Mother's Pride bread began baking plain bread in Scotland in 1958 until about 1970, and for a time it was the only type of bread that was readily available in Scotland. And it's so familiar to me because of the tartan wrapping paper. I just think it's just something that you automatically recognise and associate it with a Scottish product. So why do you think that is?
Well, what we liked especially about the plain loaf, as we called it, was that we liked the size of it, because it had nice
Height.
a good height, and a lovely crust, top and bottom. It would be a curly crust in the top, and it would be flat, just plain in the bottom. And that was really good and tasty. And it was usually nice and soft as well. Yeah. Another good thing about the Mother's Pride brand of the loaf was that I found that not all the slices were uniform. You know when today you buy a loaf and they're all it's been ready sliced and they're all the same size. Well, in the Mother's Pride loaf, you maybe get a thinner slice and a slightly wee bit thicker one, and sometimes you get a really thick one, maybe towards the end. And the outside slices of the loaf, we call them the outsiders. Well, they were the outside of the loaf, and they were really thick. And as children in the house, we didn't really rate them very highly. We didn't like them so much, but at the end, maybe that would be all that would be left in the loaf would be the outsiders. And he did eat them as well, especially for toast. I mean, you could cut them in two and toast them under the grill. Very good. And I remember when I was a student, when I was at secondary school, I used to work at the weekend in a local shop. It was a wee general store, newsagents, but also it sold everything general store. And I always remember in the summer, because it was a mining community that we lived in, grew up in, but the pits, like a lot of pits in Scotland, closed. I don't know what year that would be. It must have been about the late 60s when our local pit shut. And of course it was the main employer in the area. And an awful lot of the younger men especially had moved away. They had to move away to England for work. I suppose they would go to some of the English coalfields. But anyway, in the summer holidays, they would come up to visit their family at home. And I always remember that before they returned at the end of their holiday, they'd come down to the shop that I worked in, and they would put in their order for bread and tatty scones and special things like that they couldn't get down there in England to take back home with them. And the plain loaf was one of the things that was top of their list. They would take lots of plain loaves. I mean, they weren't going to freeze them or anything, but they would take maybe 2 or 3 for themselves that would last them through the week after they got home, and they would also take some for their neighbours, like Scottish neighbours or friends that they had from Scotland that hadn't been able to get back home, or maybe didn't have anybody up here now. So the plain loaf was very popular. And of course, as I said before, like tatty scones from a local baker and other wee speciality foods like that.
You keep saying plain loaf. What do you think the difference is between plain and pan? And is plain loaf traditionally Scottish? Because when I think of a plain loaf, I think of, like what you say, it's got the curly crust at the top and the straight crust at the bottom, but it's nice and brown and it's thick. And then a pan loaf is more what you can buy, I suppose, like a Hovis loaf.
And it's softer, isn't it? It doesn't have that hard crust top and bottom. The other loaves that you buy in supermarkets.
Yes.
Even in thinking about our local baker here today, at home, just now where we live, we're lucky to have a baker's that bakes bread every day, their own bread, and it's really good bread, and we buy it regularly from them. But it doesn't have the hard crust, although it is a good loaf.
Yeah, and when I was looking into how the plain bread was made, it was traditionally made with a high butter concentrate in it, and it would be produced in long rectangular loaf tins. And it was just cooked in one big batch, and that's how the top and bottom became so hard and brown
and had the crust in it.
Had the traditional crust, and then it would just be pulled apart
and it would just be cut up into
your rectangular block.
And sometimes I think they put when they were baking these long loaves in the oven, they would put something on top of them, like a big, I don't know, like a baking tray of some sort, to hold them down, to hold the dough down,
right?
The bread dough down, so to sort of concentrate the bread more.
All right, yeah, because it does have quite a dense texture compared to say a plain Hovis loaf or something like that.
Yes, that's right. Usual Hovis loaf.
Yeah.
Something like that. And it was always white.
Always white. Yeah.
I've never known it to be anything else but a white loaf.
So like nowadays, when I get a plain loaf, I buy it only occasionally as a treat, because I don't class it as something that's particularly healthy or good for me or my family. Well, brown bread obviously got health benefits. It's got more fibre, it's got whole wheat in it, it's got longer lasting energy throughout the day. Well, you get a plain loaf, which we kind of associate as being unhealthy. But then when we were talking to some older people, some older family members, they were associating brown bread with just their everyday staple, that they'd go down and do a hard day's work. White bread, sorry, plain bread, they'd go and do a hard day's work just with brown bread, with white bread. I mean, it just shows you that, when that's all you had, that's what you just made.
Oh, you didn't know anything else?
Yeah, you didn't know anything else with. Yeah.
Because that's what was there.
I think what I can understand from my research is that the Scottish plain loaf was just traditional in Scotland. You go into any butcher's...
Bakers?
You go into any bakers in Scotland after the war and buy a standard plain loaf, because that's all they sold. But then from my understanding is that the Mother's Pride brand came to be after a Dundee bakery, Beatties, took the loaf and decided that there'd be profit in it if they could somehow brand it, which what they did. They came up with the Mother's Pride brand, and then they decided that to allow them to sell this bread throughout other areas of Scotland, they would have to wrap it and maybe even slice it. So this is what they did. They ended up slicing the plain loaf, the traditional plain loaf, and wrapping it in a wax paper. And as far as I can tell, they use wax to stop the moisture from getting in, so they could travel it around Scotland in their delivery vans. Also, when you look back at previous marketing for Mother's Pride, the packaging was white and red striped with the traditional Mother's Pride cook in the corner. But later on, in I think it was the late 60s, they changed the packaging to tartan. To probably maybe just to show the fact and to link it in with the Scottish connection. And the Mother's Pride tartan is now actually a registered tartan in Scotland. So you could get a kilt made out of Mother's Pride tartan.
And there's another good thing about the wrapper for the loaf, for the plain loaf.
You can go in a shoot with it.
You can take it, when your loaf's finished, you can hold on to your wrapper, and when you're up in the play park, you can rub it down the slide.
That's right.
And it makes it really nice and smooth and fast, as we've experienced.
With a bump at the bottom. So it'd be a real shame if we could no longer get Mother's Pride.
Mother's Pride plain loaf.
Yeah.
Scotch